I had always been the girl who cleaned up after other people's dreams. My hands knew the weight of crystal goblets before they knew tenderness. My feet understood the echo of marble corridors better than they understood dancing. I moved through the castle like smoke present but never seen, useful but never wanted. The other servants whispered that I had been born in the shadows between the kitchen and the great hall, and some days I believed them. The morning of the harvest ceremony arrived with autumn's sharp bite in the air. I pressed my face against the cold stone wall of my tiny chamber and watched the carriages roll through the castle gates. Ladies in silk and velvet spilled from golden coaches like flowers blooming in fast motion. Their laughter tinkled through the courtyard like wind chimes, light and musical, and so far removed from my world that it might as well have been the language of birds. I was 17 and 4 months old, though no one had noticed. No one ever noticed. My reflection in the wash basin showed me what I already knew: brown hair that refused to curl no matter how I twisted it. Eyes the colour of muddy water. Skin pale from living indoors. I was not ugly, exactly, but I was unremarkable. I was the kind of girl who served wine at banquets and faded from memory before the glass touched lips. The ceremony dress lay across my narrow bed, if it could be called a dress. Grey wool scratchy against my palms, a white apron that would hide most of me, a white cap that would hide the rest. I had sewn the seams myself by candlelight, my fingers pricked raw from the needle. It was not meant to be beautiful. It was meant to make me disappear. I dressed slowly, each piece of clothing like armor against the coming humiliation. Because tonight would bring the selection, and I knew, God, how I knew that I would stand against the wall and watch every other girl be chosen while I remained frozen in place like a piece of furniture. The servants were required to attend, a living backdrop to the noble's grand ceremony. My hands shook as I tied the apron strings. The great hall buzzed with preparation when I arrived. Candles flickered from every surface, casting dancing shadows that made the stone walls seem alive. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted pheasant and honey cakes, goblets of wine that caught the light like liquid rubies. I had helped prepare this feast, my hands kneading bread at dawn, my back aching from hours bent over steaming pots. The other servants moved around me like water around a stone. They had learned long ago not to include me in their whispered conversations. I was too quiet, too strange, too prone to staring at things that weren't there. They tolerated me because I worked hard and never complained, but they didn't understand me. No one did. Lady Meredith swept into the hall in a gown of midnight blue, and I felt my chest constrict with familiar longing. She was everything I was. Not golden-haired, confident, beloved. Men's eyes followed her like compass needles pointing north. She moved through the world knowing she belonged in it, knowing she deserved its beauty. I watched her from my place by the wine table and wondered what it would feel like to walk with that certainty, to know that someone, somewhere, wanted you. The knights began arriving as the sun set. They entered in groups, their armor catching the candlelight, their voices carrying easily across the high-ceilinged room. I knew their names from years of serving them: Sir Edmund with his easy smile, Sir Thomas with his booming laugh, Sir James who always said please when he asked for wine. They were good men, mostly, but they looked through me as if I were made of glass. I poured wine and carried platters and tried to make myself even smaller than usual. The ceremony would begin soon, and with it, the selection. Every year, the unmated knights and ladies participated in an ancient ritual where partnerships were formed, some for marriage, some for courtship, some simply for the honor of the ceremony itself. And every year I stood along the wall with the other servants and felt the familiar ache of being unwanted settle into my bones like winter cold. The musicians struck up a melody that made my heart squeeze tight. I retreated to my assigned position along the eastern wall, my back pressed against cold stone, my hands clasped so tightly my knuckles went white. Around me, the other servant girls fidgeted and whispered. Some of them were pretty enough that younger knights might notice them after the formal selections were complete. an old tradition that occasionally elevated fortunate servants to ladies in waiting, or even wives. But not me, never me. I closed my eyes and tried to prepare myself for the pain of watching others be chosen while I remained invisible. When I opened my eyes, he was there. Not there in the sense of arriving. I would have noticed that, the way metal sings against metal when armor moves. He was simply present, as if he had materialized from the shadows themselves. The Black Knight, they called him, though I had never heard him called anything else. He stood near the great hearth, apart from the other knights, and even from across the room I could feel something dangerous radiating from him like heat from a forge. I had seen him before, of course. He lived in the castle, though he kept to himself in ways that made the other servants whisper stories about dark magic and cursed bloodlines. He was taller than the other knights, broader through the shoulders, and he moved with a predator's careful grace. His armor was black as a moonless night, and his surcoat bore no heraldic symbol, just empty darkness where other men displayed their pride. Tonight he wore no helmet, and I found myself staring at his face with a hunger that frightened me. Sharp cheekbones that could cut glass. A mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. Dark hair that fell to his shoulders in waves that made my fingers itch to touch them. But it was his eyes that made my breath catch black as his armor, and just as impenetrable. He was beautiful in the way that storms were beautiful, dangerous and wild and absolutely beyond my reach. I pressed myself deeper into the shadows, grateful for the grey wool that helped me disappear. The last thing I needed was to be caught staring at someone so far above my station, but I couldn't stop looking. There was something about the way he held himself, the way he watched the room without seeming to watch anything at all, that made my heart beat faster. King Aldrich raised his goblet, and the hall fell silent. I had witnessed this ceremony every year since I was old enough to carry a tray, but tonight felt different. The air itself seemed charged, like the moment before lightning strikes. The king's voice echoed off the stone walls as he spoke the traditional words about honor and partnership and the binding of souls. But then he added something I had never heard before, a brief mention of how exceptional circumstances might call for exceptional choices, how the heart's wisdom sometimes transcended convention. His eyes flickered briefly toward the Black Knight as he spoke these words, and I felt a chill of premonition. The formal dancing began, pairs of nobles sweeping across the floor in patterns older than the castle itself. I watched Lady Meredith glide through the steps with Sir Edmund, her blue gown spreading around her like water. She was grace itself, every movement deliberate and lovely. I tried to imagine myself in her place, and felt foolish for even attempting it. My feet knew kitchen stones and servant stairs, not polished ballroom floors. But then, and I would replay this moment in my mind 1,000 times, the Black Knight turned his head. Just turned it, a slight movement that should have meant nothing. But his eyes swept across the hall, across the dancing couples and chattering nobles, across the servants lined against the walls. They found me in my corner and stopped, my heart hammered against my ribs. He was looking at me. Actually looking, not through me or past me, but at me, as if I was something worth seeing. His gaze was heavy as a physical touch, and I felt exposed despite my modest dress and careful positioning. Heat crawled up my neck and across my cheeks. I wanted to look away, knew I should look away, but I couldn't make my eyes obey. For what felt like an eternity but must have been only seconds, we stared at each other across the crowded room. His expression revealed nothing, but I thought I saw something flicker in those dark eyes, surprise, maybe, or recognition, as if he was seeing something in me that I didn't know existed. Then Sir James stumbled during a particularly complicated turn, and laughter rippled through the hall. The spell broke. The Black Knight's attention shifted back to the general festivities, and I was left trembling against the wall, my hands pressed flat against stone to keep them steady. Had that really happened? Had the Black Knight, the most mysterious, untouchable man in the castle, really looked at me? Or was it wishful thinking, the kind of desperate fantasy that lonely girls tell themselves to make the ache bearable? I spent the rest of the dancing trying to convince myself it had meant nothing. He had been scanning the room, that was all. His gaze had simply passed over me the way it passed over everyone else. I was reading significance into something perfectly ordinary because I wanted so desperately to be significant to someone, anyone. But my heart wouldn't slow down, and my skin still felt warm where his eyes had touched. The moment came too soon, and not soon enough. King Aldrich called for the selection, and my stomach dropped like a stone through dark water. This was the part of the ceremony where I would be reminded, once again, that I was invisible. The part where every unmarried knight would choose a partner from among the eligible ladies, and I would watch from the shadows and pretend it didn't tear something inside me. The king's voice carried clearly as he recited the ancient words. Let each knight choose according to his heart's guidance, remembering that honor lies not in rank but in truth, not in expectation, but in genuine feeling. Another departure from tradition. Usually the ceremony emphasized proper matches and social harmony. Tonight, there seemed to be an undercurrent of permission for the unconventional. The unmarried knights formed a line in order of rank. Sir Edmund first, as the king's nephew, Sir Thomas second, Sir James third. They moved with confidence, these men who had never doubted their place in the world. Each one knew exactly which lady he would choose, which hand he would take, which face would light up at his approach. Sir Edmund walked directly to Lady Meredith, and she curtsied with perfect grace. Of course! They were both golden and beautiful and matched like pieces of the same puzzle. The hall erupted in approving murmurs as he led her to the centre of the floor. Sir Thomas chose Lady Catherine, a redhead with kind eyes and a quick laugh. Sir James selected Lady Anne, who blushed prettily and took his offered arm with obvious delight. One by one, the knights made their selections. One by one, the most eligible ladies of the court were claimed. I pressed myself further into my corner and tried to make my heart stop hoping for something impossible. The line of knights grew shorter. The number of available ladies dwindled. Soon there would be none left, and the ceremony would move to its next phase, the formal presentation of the chosen pairs. Then, if tradition held, younger knights might approach servant girls for the informal dancing that followed. But that was charity, not choice, kindness, not desire. I was so focused on preparing myself for disappointment that I almost missed it when the last few knights made their choices. Almost missed the moment when the eligible ladies had all been selected and the Black Knight still stood in line. He was last. Always last, I realized, because in previous years he had never participated. He attended the ceremony because it was required, but he never chose anyone. The Black Knight was a creature apart, untouchable and uninterested in the mortal concerns of partnership and romance. Except tonight, he didn't leave the line. The hall had grown quiet, conversation dying as people realized what was happening. The Black Knight remained in position, his dark eyes scanning the room with purpose. He was going to choose someone. After years of standing apart, he was finally going to participate in the selection. But there were no ladies left. Every eligible woman had been claimed. Then I felt the exact moment when his eyes found me again. The air in the hall seemed to thicken, and I heard Lady Meredith whisper something sharp to Sir Edmund. Other conversations stopped mid-sentence. The musician's melody faltered. He was looking at me, and he was walking. No, that wasn't possible. I was imagining things, letting my starved heart conjure fantasies from thin air. He was walking towards someone behind me, or beside me, or... But there was no one behind me, no one beside me. There was only the stone wall and the shadows I had made my home. His footsteps echoed like thunder in the sudden silence. Each step brought him closer, and with each step, my world tilted a little further off its axis. This couldn't be happening. Men like him didn't choose girls like me. The universe had rules, and one of those rules was that servant girls remained invisible to knights, especially knights who looked like fallen angels and moved like poetry written in steel. He stopped in front of me. I couldn't breathe, literally could not draw air into my lungs. He stood so close I could see the fine embroidery on his black surcoat, could smell leather and metal and something darker underneath pine, maybe, or winter nights. His presence was overwhelming, like standing too close to a bonfire. The hall held its breath. He extended his hand. For a moment I stared at it stupidly, my mind refusing to process what was happening. His hand was larger than I had expected, with long fingers and scars across the knuckles that spoke of hard use. He wore no rings, no symbols of rank or alliance. Just skin and bone and an invitation that made my heart stop beating. I looked up at his face, searching for some sign that this was a jest or a mistake. But his expression was serious, almost grim, and his dark eyes held mine with an intensity that made my knees weak. The silence stretched impossibly long. I could feel every person in the hall watching us, could practically hear the thoughts racing through their minds. What was the Black Knight doing? Why was he reaching for a servant? Had he lost his mind? My hand trembled as I lifted it toward his. This was madness. This was social suicide. This was impossible. Our fingers touched. The moment his skin met mine, something electric shot through my entire body. It was like touching lightning, like grabbing hold of a star. His hand was warm and rough and absolutely real, and when his fingers closed around mine, I felt something inside me that had been sleeping for 17 years suddenly wake up. He lifted our joined hands into the air. The gasp that rose from the crowd was like the sound of a wave breaking. I heard someone, Lady Meredith, I thought make a noise of pure shock. Whispers exploded through the hall like wildfire, everyone talking at once, everyone trying to understand what they were witnessing, but I barely heard them. All my attention was focused on the man beside me, on the way his hand felt wrapped around mine, on the impossible reality of being chosen. Me, the invisible servant girl, the shadow in the corner. He had chosen me. I had never fainted in my life, but I came close in that moment. The world swayed around me, the candle-lit hall spinning like a child's top. Only the steady pressure of his hand in mine kept me grounded, kept me from floating away on a tide of disbelief and terror and something that might have been joy if I had been brave enough to name it. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. I caught fragments through the rushing in my ears. Servant girl! Impossible! What can he be thinking? Each word was a needle piercing the fragile bubble of this moment, reminding me of exactly how wrong this was. King Aldrich's voice cut through the chaos, and I felt rather than saw him approaching, my vision had gone strange, everything too bright and too distant. But I could hear the confusion in his tone, carefully controlled but unmistakably present. Sir Damon, the king said formally the first time I had ever heard the Black Knight's actual name spoken aloud. Are you certain of your choice? Damon. His name was Damon, and it suited him perfectly dark and dangerous and beautiful as sin. I am, Your Majesty, he replied, his voice steady and sure. No hesitation, no apology, no suggestion that this was anything other than exactly what he intended. The king paused, and I could feel him studying us both. When he spoke again, his tone was carefully neutral. The ancient laws allow for a knight to choose any unmarried woman within the castle walls, regardless of station, provided she consents freely. This right has not been invoked in living memory, but it remains valid. My heart nearly stopped. There were ancient provisions for this? Laws that actually permitted such an unprecedented choice? The lady's consent, then? King Aldrich asked. For the first time since this impossible scene had begun, Damon looked down at me. Really looked at me, his dark eyes searching my face with gentle intensity. The question was there, unspoken but unmistakable. Would I choose this too? I realized he was going to lift my veil. The servant's cap I wore had a thin white veil attached, designed to partially obscure my features and mark my status. It was part of the uniform, part of the invisibility I had wrapped around myself like armor. And he was going to remove it, here, in front of everyone. Panic fluttered in my throat like a trapped bird. Without the veil, I would be completely exposed. There would be nowhere to hide, no shadows to retreat into. Everyone would see me clearly, and they would see that I was nothing special, nothing worth this kind of attention. But his eyes held mine steady. and something in their depths seemed to say, "Trust me." I had never trusted anyone in my life. I had learned early that trust was a luxury servant girls couldn't afford. But in that moment, with his fingers warm against my chin and the entire court watching our every move, I found myself nodding. The smallest movement, barely perceptible, but enough. His hand moved to the edge of my veil. The whispers in the hall died to absolute silence, as if the entire room was holding its breath. Even the musicians had stopped playing. The only sound was the crackling of torches and the thunderous beating of my own heart. He lifted the veil slowly, carefully, as if he were unwrapping something precious. The white fabric fluttered away from my face, and I felt the strange sensation of air touching skin that had been hidden. I wanted to close my eyes, wanted to turn away, wanted to run from this exposure that felt more intimate than anything I had ever experienced. But I didn't. I stayed still and let him see me. Really see me, for the first time. His expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. A kind of recognition, as if he had been searching for something and had finally found it. His thumb brushed across my cheekbone in a touch so gentle it made my eyes water. Then he smiled. It was barely a smile, just the faintest curve at one corner of his mouth. But it transformed his entire face, softening the harsh angles and making him look almost human, approachable, real. "Yes," I whispered, the word barely audible but carrying clearly in the absolute silence. "Yes, I consent." The hall erupted. Conversations exploded on all sides as nobles tried to process what they had witnessed. I heard shock and scandal and speculation, heard my own name being whispered for what felt like the first time in my life. But through it all, Damon stood unmoved, his attention focused entirely on me, as if we were the only two people in the world. King Aldrich raised his hand for silence, and gradually the noise died down. "Then let it be recorded." He announced formally that Sir Damon has chosen Lady Elara as his partner for this ceremony, with her full and free consent according to the ancient laws of selection. Lady Elara. Not Elara of the kitchens or the servant girl, but Lady Elara, as if my new status had been transformed by the simple act of being chosen. Damon's hand was still cupping my face, his thumb still tracing gentle patterns across my skin. I leaned into the touch without meaning to, starved for tenderness I hadn't known I was craving. The gesture made his almost smile deepen, and he leaned closer until his breath was warm against my ear. "You're shaking," he murmured, his voice so low only I could hear it. "I'm terrified," I whispered back. "Good, so am I." The admission was so unexpected, so vulnerable, that I looked up at him in surprise. But before I could respond, the king was calling for the traditional partnering dance to begin, and Damon was offering me his arm with the formal courtesy due to a lady. A lady. That's what I was now, at least for this evening. The thought was both thrilling and absolutely terrifying. As we joined the other couples in the centre of the hall, I caught Lady Meredith's eye. Her expression was no longer just shocked, it was coldly furious, as if my elevation somehow diminished her own worth. Sir Edmund, beside her, wore a look of amused disbelief, as though he were watching an entertaining farce. But other faces showed different reactions. Lady Catherine looked genuinely pleased, offering me an encouraging smile. Sir James appeared thoughtful rather than judgmental. Even King Aldrich watched us with what seemed like approval. The music began, and Damon led me into the first turn. I stumbled slightly, unused to the steps I had only observed from afar, but his steady hand at my waist kept me upright. His other hand held mine firmly, guiding me through movements that felt impossibly complex. "Just follow my lead," he murmured as we turned. "Don't think about them, just focus on me." I did as he said, letting his confidence carry us both through the intricate figures of the dance. He moved with the same predatory grace I had noticed from across the room, but up close it became something else entirely. He was leading me, yes, but he was also protecting me, his presence steady and sure as I navigated steps I had never learned. When I missed a beat, he adjusted seamlessly. When I stumbled, he caught me. When the other couple's movements threatened to overwhelm me, he positioned himself as a shield, giving me space to find my rhythm. By the time the dance ended, I felt like I could fly. The applause seemed distant and unimportant. What mattered was the way he looked at me as we straightened, the way his eyes seemed to say that I had done well, that I belonged exactly where I was. But as the evening progressed and the initial shock of his choice began to fade into general conversation, I felt reality creeping back in. I was still a servant girl in borrowed status, still utterly unprepared for the world I had been thrust into. And everyone else knew it too. The question that had been haunting me since he first extended his hand grew louder with each passing hour. What could possibly happen next? The rest of the ceremony passed in a haze of overwhelming sensation. I moved through the motions like a sleepwalker, my hand still clasped in Damon's as we joined the other selected pairs in the center of the hall. The formal presentations blurred together names and titles and polite applause that seemed to come from underwater. When our turn came, when King Aldrich announced us to the assembled court, I heard my name spoken aloud in that grand space for the first time. Sir Damon of the Northern March and Lady Elara. Just Elara. The king had granted me the courtesy title without mention of my humble origins, a kindness that made my throat close up entirely. Not the servant girl or of the kitchens, but simply a name that belonged to a person worthy of respect. The formal partnering dance had been one thing, a single performance where Damon's skill could carry us both. But as the evening wore on and we joined the feast, I felt increasingly out of place at the high table where the selected couples were seated. The conversations flowed around me in languages I barely understood, court politics and references to people and places that existed in a world far above my own. I sat quietly, hyper-aware of my rough hands on fine crystal, of my simple grey dress among their silks and velvets, of the way servants I had worked alongside for years now approached our table with careful deference. Damon remained attentive throughout, ensuring my wineglass never emptied, that I had the choicest portions of food, that no one could ignore my presence the way they had for 17 years. But even his kindness couldn't quiet the growing voice in my head that insisted this was all an elaborate mistake. What had possessed him to make such a choice? Was it pity? Some kind of elaborate jest that I was too naive to understand? Had he simply wanted to cause a scandal, and I was the most shocking option available? The doubt crept through me like poison, tainting every gesture of courtesy, every moment of inclusion. I began to see myself through their eyes, a plain servant girl in an ugly dress, so far beneath his station that his choice bordered on the absurd. I remembered every slight, every moment of invisibility, every reminder that I was nothing special. By the time the evening feast began, I was drowning in second guesses. The conversation around our table was polite but strained. Lady Catherine made gentle attempts to include me, asking about my interests with genuine kindness. Sir James actually seemed intrigued by the unprecedented situation, engaging me in discussion about books with surprising respect. But I could feel the weight of other stares, hear the whispered conversations happening just out of earshot. Lady Meredith's table was close enough that I caught fragments of their commentary pathetic. Amusing novelty. How long will it last? Each word was a dart finding its mark, confirming every fear I had harbored about this impossible situation. When couples began drifting toward the dance floor for more casual entertainment, I felt my carefully constructed composure finally crack. The wine, the overwhelming attention, the constant battle against my own insecurities. It was too much. I started to rise from my chair, already composing the words that would extract me gracefully from this situation. I would excuse myself quietly, retreat to the servants' quarters where I belonged, and pretend this entire evening had been a beautiful dream. In the morning, things would return to normal. He would go back to being the untouchable Black Knight, and I would go back to being invisible. It was better this way. Safer. His hand covered mine on the table, stopping me mid-motion. The touch was gentle but unmistakable, and when I looked up at his face, I saw something there that made my carefully constructed walls begin to crumble. Not pity, not amusement. Not the polite tolerance I had been expecting, something warmer, something that looked almost like caring. He shook his head slightly, the motion barely perceptible, but clearly a message. Stay. The evening is far from over, he said quietly, his voice pitched for my ears alone. And you haven't seen the garden yet. The garden? I blinked at him in confusion. Why would I need to see the garden? Because, he said, standing and offering me his hand with the same formal courtesy he had shown all evening. It's beautiful in the moonlight. And I suspect you've spent far too many years watching other people's happiness instead of experiencing your own. The words hit me like a physical blow. How could he see that? How could he understand something about me that I had barely admitted to myself? Before I could voice any of my protests, before I could list all the reasons why this was impossible, he was leading me away from the table and toward the great doors that opened onto the castle's gardens. The night air was crisp against my flushed skin, carrying the scent of late roses and wood smoke. The moon was indeed beautiful, casting silver light across carefully tended paths and reflecting in the small fountains scattered throughout the space. But more than the beauty, I was struck by the silence. After hours of constant noise and conversation, the quiet felt like balm on raw nerves. I could breathe here, could think without the weight of judging eyes. Better? Damon asked, and I realized he had been watching me carefully. Much, I admitted. Thank you. We walked slowly along one of the main paths, not touching, but close enough that I could feel his warmth. The garden was a place I knew well. I often came here during my free time to tend injured birds, or simply to find peace. But seeing it through his eyes, sharing it with him, made it feel entirely new. You come here often, he observed, and it wasn't a question. How did you know? The way you move through the space. You know exactly where the uneven stones are, which paths lead where. This is your sanctuary. The accuracy of his observation made my chest tight. It's the only place I've ever felt, free, I suppose, where I could just exist without having to be useful to anyone. He stopped walking and turned to face me fully. In the moonlight, his features were softer, more human. The harsh angles that made him seem so intimidating in candlelight became simply striking. Is that what you think you have to be? Useful? The question caught me off guard. I'm a servant, usefulness island, everything. Not to me. The simple statement hung between us like a bridge I wasn't sure I was brave enough to cross. I wanted to believe him, wanted to accept that someone could value me for reasons beyond my ability to pour wine and stay invisible. But 17 years of conditioning weren't easily overcome. I don't understand, I whispered. I don't understand why you chose me, or what you want from me, or what any of this means. Instead of answering immediately, he reached up to touch my face, his fingers gentle against my cheek. The gesture was becoming familiar, but it still made my heart race. It means, he said carefully, that for the first time in longer than I care to admit, someone looked at me and saw a person rather than a reputation. It means that your honest eyes and kind hands have been haunting my thoughts for weeks. It means I was tired of pretending I didn't care about anything. Weeks? I echoed, stunned. I told you I've been watching you. Did you think that was idle observation? The implication settled over me slowly. He hadn't chosen me on impulse or out of pity. He had been thinking about me, noticing me, long before tonight's ceremony. The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. But what happens now? I asked, voicing the fear that had been growing all evening. When the sun rises and this becomes, whatever this becomes? His expression grew serious, almost grim. I don't know, he admitted. The honest answer is that I don't know what happens next. This isn't a situation covered in any etiquette manual. The honesty should have been frightening. Instead, it was oddly comforting. He wasn't making promises he couldn't keep or painting impossible pictures of our future. He was simply acknowledging that we were both stepping into uncharted territory. Are you frightened? I asked. Terrified, he replied without hesitation. I've spent years keeping everyone at a distance. It's safer that way for them and for me, but with you. He trailed off, shaking his head as if words weren't adequate. With me? I prompted. With you, I find myself wanting to try. Wanting to see what might be possible if I stopped hiding behind reputation and duty. Before I could respond, before I could fully process the implications of what he was saying, he was kissing me. This kiss was different from the brief, desperate one in the alcove days before. This was slow and careful and thorough, as if he were learning the shape of my mouth, the taste of my lips. His hands cradled my face with a tenderness that made my knees weak, and I found myself rising on my toes to meet him, my own hands fisting in the fabric of his surcoat. When we finally broke apart, both breathing hard, I felt fundamentally changed. This wasn't just attraction or curiosity anymore. This was something deeper, more dangerous, more real. Elara, he murmured against my forehead, my name a prayer in the darkness. Yes? Tomorrow, there will be consequences. People will have opinions and expectations and demands. But right now, in this moment, I need you to know something. I waited, hardly daring to breathe. You are not invisible to me, you never were, and you never will be. The words settled into my chest like seeds finding fertile ground. For the first time in my life, I felt truly seen, not just looked at, but understood and valued and desired. Whatever came next, whatever challenges we would face, I was no longer facing them alone. The next morning brought reality crashing back with the subtlety of a battering ram. I woke in my own narrow bed, but this time I remembered every detail of returning to my chamber. Damon had escorted me personally, walking through corridors where late-night servants paused in their tasks to stare at the unprecedented sight. At my door, he had kissed my hand with formal courtesy before murmuring that he would find me the next day. The memory made my cheeks burn with a mixture of pleasure and embarrassment. Had we really been so visible? Had our evening in the garden been witnessed by others? My questions were answered the moment I entered the kitchen. Every conversation stopped. Every pair of eyes turned toward me with expressions ranging from curious to envious to openly hostile. The silence stretched uncomfortably long before Cook cleared her throat and barked orders that sent everyone scurrying back to their tasks. But the whispers started almost immediately. I caught fragments as I moved through my morning duties. Above herself, won't last a fortnight. Black Knight's fancy. The words stung, each one a reminder of how precarious my situation truly was. Mary from the gardens cornered me by the bread ovens, her eyes bright with malicious curiosity. Well then, she said, her voice pitched just loud enough for others to hear. I suppose you'll be leaving us soon? Moving up to the nobles' quarters? The question was loaded with implications I didn't know how to address. Had my status actually changed? Was I expected to leave my position in the kitchens? The ceremony had elevated me for one evening, but what did that mean for the days that followed? I don't know, I answered honestly, which only seemed to fuel her speculation. Course you don't, she said with false sympathy. Poor thing, probably doesn't even understand what she's gotten herself into. I wanted to defend myself, to explain that I wasn't some naive child stumbling blindly into a situation beyond my comprehension. But the truth was, I didn't understand. I had no framework for navigating the space between servant and whatever I was becoming. The morning wore on with agonizing slowness. Every task felt different now, colored by uncertainty and the weight of watching eyes. When I served breakfast to the early rising nobles, the reactions were even more pointed than those in the kitchen. Some treated me with new deference, as if my association with Sir Damon required courtesy. Others made deliberate shows of ignoring me, reinforcing that they considered my elevation temporary at best. Lady Meredith fell into the latter category, making a point of dismissing me with curt gestures when I approached her table. Sir Edmund seemed to find the entire situation amusing, making comments just loud enough for me to hear about interesting developments and unconventional choices. His tone suggested he was watching an entertainment rather than witnessing a genuine relationship. The worst moment came when I was refilling water pitchers at the side table. A group of younger nobles had gathered nearby, their conversation carrying clearly across the mostly empty hall. "I still can't fathom what he sees in her," Lady Catherine's cousin was saying. "She's so ordinary." "Perhaps that's exactly the appeal," replied Sir Marcus, his voice dripping with insinuation. "Something unspoiled, innocent, easy to shape." The implication made my stomach turn. They were talking about me as if I were an object rather than a person, speculating about Damon's motives in ways that reduced both of us to crude stereotypes. "How long do we think it will last?" asked another voice. "A month? A week?" "I'd wager less," Sir Marcus replied. "Men like that tire of their toys quickly. She'll be back in the kitchen soon enough, probably worse off than before." Their laughter was sharp and cruel, cutting through me like broken glass. But worse than their words was the seed of doubt they planted. Was that what I was to him? A temporary diversion? An innocent to be shaped and then discarded when the novelty wore off? I tried to finish my tasks quickly, desperate to escape their casual cruelty. But my hands were shaking, and when I reached for the heavy pitcher, my grip slipped. The ceramic shattered against the stone floor with a sound like thunder. Water spread across the flagstones in a rapidly expanding puddle, and ceramic shards scattered in all directions. The noise brought every conversation in the hall to an abrupt halt. I dropped to my knees immediately, trying to gather the broken pieces with hands that trembled violently. Shame flooded through me in waves. Shame at my clumsiness. Shame at being caught listening. Shame at being the subject of their amusement in the first place. "Careful there, girl," Sir Edmund called out with false concern. "We wouldn't want you to hurt yourself. Sir Damon might be displeased." The emphasis he placed on the final word made several people snicker, and I felt my face burn with humiliation. They were making sport of me, of him, of whatever fragile thing had bloomed between us the night before. I was so focused on gathering the sharp pieces that I didn't notice one particularly jagged shard until it bit deep into my palm. Pain fled bright and immediate, and blood welled up crimson against my pale skin. But even as I wrapped my hand in my apron to stem the bleeding, all I could think about was escape. I needed to get away from their laughter, from their speculation, from the crushing weight of being watched and judged and found wanting. I stumbled to my feet and fled toward the servants' entrance, abandoning dignity in favor of speed. Behind me, I heard more laughter echoing through the hall, confirming every fear about how this situation would play out. It was only as I reached the corridor that I glimpsed a figure standing in the shadows near the main doors. Black clothing, still posture, familiar silhouette that made my heart clench painfully. Damon had been there, had heard everything. Our eyes met for one devastating moment across the hall, and I saw something in his expression that made my world tilt dangerously. Not anger at their words, not defense of my honor, but something that looked almost like resignation. As if he had expected this, as if he had known exactly how this would play out, as if, perhaps, he agreed with them. The thought hit me like a physical blow, and I ran faster, desperate to reach somewhere dark and quiet where I could curl up and die of shame. By the time I reached the pantry where I had hidden the day before, tears were streaming down my face and blood was seeping through my makeshift bandage. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the agony in my chest. What if they were right? What if this was all just temporary amusement for him, and I had been too naive to recognize the signs? The possibility that I had misread everything, that my desperate hope had blinded me to obvious truth, was almost too much to bear. I pressed my back against the cool stone wall and tried to stop shaking, tried to think rationally about what I had witnessed, but all I could hear was their laughter, see that moment of resignation in his dark eyes. Maybe this was what I deserved for daring to dream above my station. Maybe invisibility really was safer than this kind of exposure. The thought made me cry harder, mourning not just what I was losing, but what I had foolishly believed I might gain. I had been hiding in the pantry for perhaps an hour when I heard footsteps approaching. Not the quick, efficient steps of servants going about their duties, but slower, more deliberate movement that made my heart rate spike. Please let it be cook, I prayed silently, or one of the other kitchen staff come to fetch supplies. Anyone but Ilara. His voice was quiet, but it carried clearly through the wooden door. I pressed myself deeper into the shadows between the flour sacks and grain barrels, as if I could somehow disappear entirely. I couldn't face him right now. Couldn't bear to see pity or gentle dismissal in his eyes, couldn't endure whatever careful words he had prepared to end this before it became more complicated. I know you're in there, he continued, still quiet but with an edge of something I couldn't identify. I can hear you breathing. Damn, I tried to make myself even smaller to control my ragged breathing, but it was useless. After a moment, I heard the soft scrape of wood on stone as he settled himself outside the door. Not demanding entry, not threatening consequences. Just waiting. The consideration made my eyes burn with fresh tears. They told me about the picture, he said finally. About what you heard. Of course they had. Probably with great amusement, delighted to report how the servant girl had humiliated herself, how she had proven exactly how unsuitable she was for elevation above her station. Are you hurt? The simple question, asked with such careful concern, nearly undid me completely. I looked down at my palm, still wrapped in blood-stained cloth. The cut throbbed steadily, but it was nothing compared to the wound in my chest. My hand, I whispered, not sure if my voice was carrying through the door. May I see? I wanted to refuse, to maintain the barrier between us until I could compose myself properly, but something in his tone, not commanding, not impatient, just genuinely worried, made me reach for the door handle. I opened it just wide enough to slip out, keeping my eyes fixed on the floor. He was indeed sitting against the opposite wall, his long legs stretched out in front of him in a pose that looked almost casual. But there was nothing casual about the intensity of his attention as I emerged from my hiding place. He rose fluidly to his feet and stepped closer, his hand extending toward mine. Let me see. I showed him my bandaged palm reluctantly, expecting him to dismiss it as a minor injury not worth concern. Instead, he took my hand in both of his, examining the makeshift bandage with careful attention. This needs to be cleaned properly, he said, his thumb tracing along my wrist in a way that made my pulse jump, and rewrapped. The gentleness in his voice, the careful way he held my injured hand, was so at odds with what I had expected that I couldn't hold back a sob. He looked up at my face immediately, his expression shifting from concern to something fiercer. What did they say to you? The truth. I choked out, tears spilling over despite my efforts to contain them. That I'm nothing special, that you'll tire of me quickly, that I'm just a temporary amusement. His jaw tightened visibly, and I saw his hands clench into fists before he deliberately relaxed them. But when he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. And you believe them? The question caught me off guard. I had expected him to offer gentle reassurance, to deny their words while secretly knowing they were true. I hadn't expected him to challenge my acceptance of their assessment. I struggled to find words. I don't know what to believe. I don't understand why you chose me, or what you want from me, or how any of this can possibly work. They're right that I don't belong in your world. My world, he repeated, and there was something sharp in his tone. Do you know what my world is, Alara? I looked up at him in confusion. It's duty without choice, service without gratitude, years of being useful while remaining fundamentally alone. His dark eyes held mine steadily. It's exactly what your world has been, just dressed in finer clothes. The parallel hit me like a physical blow. I had been so focused on the differences in our stations that I hadn't considered the similarities in our isolation. The difference between us, he continued, is that you chose kindness despite having every reason for bitterness. You remained gentle despite being ignored. You kept your capacity for wonder despite being treated as invisible. His words washed over me like warm water, but I couldn't quite let myself believe them. I'm still just a servant. No. The certainty in his voice was absolute. You're a woman who deserves better than invisibility. You're someone who rescues injured birds when you think no one is watching. Someone who reads poetry by candlelight and dreams of seeing the ocean. Someone who looked at me, really looked at me, and saw a person instead of a reputation. I stared at him, my heart hammering against my ribs. The way he spoke about me, as if he saw something valuable that I couldn't recognize in myself, was overwhelming. Those people in there. He gestured toward the Great Hall. They're afraid of anything that challenges their understanding of how the world should work. Your elevation threatens their certainty about who deserves what. Of course they want to tear it down. But what if they're right? I whispered. What if this doesn't last? What if you do get tired of me? Instead of offering easy reassurance, he was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. I can't promise you forever, Elara. I won't make vows I might not be able to keep. But I can promise you this. My interest in you isn't based on novelty or innocence or any of the crude things they're imagining. It's based on who you are as a person. And that isn't going to change overnight. The honesty was both terrifying and comforting. He wasn't painting impossible pictures of our future or making declarations he couldn't support. He was simply acknowledging that we were both taking a risk. I'm scared, I admitted. Good, he replied, echoing his words from the night before. So am I, but I'd rather be scared with you than safely alone without you. Before I could respond, he was cupping my face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears on my cheeks. The gesture was becoming familiar, but it still made my heart race. Will you trust me? He asked quietly. Not blindly, not without question, but enough to see where this leads. I searched his face, looking for any sign of deception or hidden agenda, but all I saw was sincerity and something that looked like hope. Yes, I whispered. He kissed me then, soft and careful and absolutely certain. It was a claiming and a promise, and a defiance of everyone who thought we didn't belong together. When we broke apart, he rested his forehead against mine and smiled that rare, transformative expression that made him look younger and infinitely more human. Good, he murmured, because I have a proposition for you. Come away with me. The words seemed to hang in the air between us like a bridge I wasn't sure I was brave enough to cross. I stared at him, my mind struggling to process what he had just suggested. There's a holding in the north, he continued, his voice careful but determined. Ravenscroft Keep, where I serve as the king's representative during the winter months. It's smaller than this castle, quieter, far from court politics and whispered scandals. He paused, studying my face for my reaction. I'm due to travel there within the fortnight to oversee the harvest tributes and prepare for the winter season. I want you to come with me. The offer was more than I had ever dared to dream, but it was also impossible. Servants didn't simply leave their positions to travel with knights. There were contracts and obligations and a dozen practical considerations that made such things unthinkable. I tried to voice these concerns, stumbling over words that seemed inadequate to explain the magnitude of what he was suggesting, but he was shaking his head before I finished speaking. I've already spoken to the king, he said quietly. Your service contract can be transferred to my household for the duration of my northern posting. It's unusual, but not unprecedented. He had already spoken to the king, had already thought through the practical details, the official permissions that would make this possible. The realization hit me like a physical blow. He had been planning this, thinking about it seriously enough to take concrete steps. But why? I whispered. His free hand came up to cup my cheek, his touch warm against skin that had gone cold with shock. Because I can't imagine being without you now that I've found you. Because you deserve to see more of the world than these castle walls. Because. He paused, searching for words, and I saw something vulnerable flicker across his features. Because for the first time in years, I want to wake up in the morning. I want to see what each day might bring instead of simply enduring it. The raw honesty in his voice made my throat close up. This wasn't just about attraction or curiosity. This was about hope, about the possibility of happiness that neither of us had dared to reach for before. I don't know how to be a companion to a knight, I said, the admission barely audible. I don't know the proper protocols or behaviors. I've never been anywhere but here. Good, he replied. and the firmness in his voice surprised me. "I don't want you to become someone else. I want you exactly as you are." The simple declaration made my heart stutter. Exactly as I was, not transformed or improved or elevated to meet some impossible standard, just me. But even as part of me soared at the possibility, another part remained stubbornly practical. What happens when we return, when your northern duties are complete and we come back to court? It was the question that had been haunting me since our first conversation. What future could we possibly have together? The ceremony had been one thing, a single evening's deviation from normal order. But an actual relationship, sustained partnership between a knight and a former servant, was something else entirely. He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on our intertwined hands. When he finally looked up, I saw a complexity in his expression that made my chest tight. "I don't know," he admitted. "The honest answer is that I don't know what happens when we return. Court politics are complex, and there are forces beyond our control that will have opinions about us." The honesty was both comforting and terrifying. He wasn't making promises he couldn't keep or painting impossible pictures of a future that defied reality. He was simply asking me to step into uncertainty with him, to choose possibility over safety. "But I know what happens if we don't take this chance," he continued. "We spend the rest of our lives wondering what might have been, and I've spent enough years wondering." I looked around the kitchen corridor where we stood, thinking about all the hours I had spent in similar spaces serving others, cleaning up after others, living in the margins of other people's stories. It was safe and familiar, but it was also a cage that had kept me trapped for 17 years. The thought of leaving terrified me. But the thought of staying, of watching him ride away while I remained bound to a life that had never truly fit, was infinitely worse. "How long would we be gone?" I asked. 4 months, perhaps 5. Through the winter and until the spring roads become passable again. 4 to 5 months. Long enough to truly understand what lay between us, to see if this connection could survive beyond the artificial intensity of the court ceremony. Long enough to discover who I might become when freed from the expectations and limitations that had shaped my entire life. "I would have my own quarters?" I asked, suddenly aware of the implications of traveling alone with him. A smile ghosted across his lips. "Of course. I'm not asking you to compromise your reputation more than it already has been. Ravenscroft has a full household staff. You would have proper chambers, proper protection, proper respect." The consideration in his planning, the attention to details that would preserve my dignity, made my decision easier. "Yes," I said, the word emerging before my rational mind could interfere. "Yes, I'll come with you." The smile that transformed his face was brilliant enough to light the entire corridor. Before I could second-guess my decision, before I could catalogue all the ways this could end in disaster, he was kissing me with a joy that made my heart race. When we finally broke apart, both of us breathing hard, he rested his forehead against mine and laughed. Actually laughed. A sound of pure happiness that I had never heard from him before. "When?" I asked, still dizzy from the kiss and the magnitude of what I had just agreed to. 1 fortnight from today. That gives us time to make proper arrangements, to ensure everything is handled correctly." His expression grew more serious. "There will be talk, Ilara. More than there has been. Some people will never understand or approve of what we're doing." I thought about the cruel laughter in the great hall, the speculation about how long I would last, the betting on when he would tire of me. The prospect of more scrutiny was daunting, but not as daunting as the alternative. "Let them talk," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. "I've been invisible for 17 years. If I have to be visible now, I'd rather be visible with you than invisible alone." Something shifted in his expression at my words, a deepening of the warmth in his dark eyes. "You realize," he said quietly, "that you've become rather extraordinary without even trying." Before I could protest or deflect the compliment, he was kissing me again, soft and sweet and full of promise. 2 weeks. 14 days to prepare for the biggest change of my life, to say goodbye to everything familiar, to step into an unknown future with a man who had shown me what it felt like to be wanted. For the first time in my life, I couldn't wait to see what tomorrow would bring. The next 2 weeks passed in a whirlwind of preparation and barely controlled anxiety. Word of my impending departure spread through the castle with the speed of wildfire. The servants' reactions ranged from envious to skeptical to openly hostile. Mary from the gardens made pointed comments about girls who got above themselves, while Thomas the baker's apprentice seemed genuinely pleased for me, offering shy congratulations and wishes for safe travel. Cook's reaction surprised me the most. Rather than the disapproval I had expected, she cornered me by the bread ovens 3 days after Damon's proposition and fixed me with her no-nonsense stare. "You listen to me, girl," she said, her voice pitched low enough that the other workers couldn't hear. "I've been in this castle for 30 years, and I've seen plenty of girls think they could rise above their station through a man's attention. Most of them end up worse off than when they started." My stomach dropped, but I forced myself to meet her eyes. "Yes, Cook. But that one," she jerked her head toward the door where Damon had been visible just moments before, "he's different. I've seen the way he looks at you, child. Like you're something rare and precious. And I've seen the way you look at him like he hung the moon and stars." Her weathered face softened slightly. 30 years I've been watching people, and I've learned to tell the difference between desire and genuine caring. What he feels for you, that's not temporary. Relief flooded through me so suddenly I felt lightheaded. "You really think so?" "I know so, but—" Her expression grew stern again. "You be careful with your heart, Elara. Hearts are fragile things, especially ones that haven't had much practice at being cared for." She pressed a small pouch into my hands despite my protests. "For emergencies," she said gruffly. "And you write to me, you hear? I want to know how you fare in the world beyond these walls." The idea that anyone would want news of my well-being was still startling enough to bring tears to my eyes. I promised to write, knowing that her concern would be a lifeline in whatever challenges lay ahead. Meanwhile, the nobles' reactions were more complex and varied than I had anticipated. Lady Meredith remained coldly hostile, making a point of ignoring me completely when our paths crossed. But her obvious anger suggested that she saw my elevation as more than temporary amusement. It threatened something in her worldview that mere novelty wouldn't have touched. Sir Edmund continued to treat the situation as entertaining theatre, making jokes about interesting developments and unconventional arrangements. But even his amusement seemed to carry an undercurrent of genuine curiosity about how this unprecedented situation would resolve itself. To my surprise, it was Lady Catherine who proved most supportive. She sought me out in the garden one afternoon, approaching with genuine warmth rather than the careful courtesy most nobles showed to servants. "I wanted to wish you well on your journey," she said, settling beside me on the stone bench where I often read. "I think what you're doing is rather brave." "Brave or foolish?" I replied, still uncertain which assessment was accurate. "Perhaps both," she said with a smile. "The best adventures usually are." She paused, studying my face with intelligent eyes. "You know, I envy you rather." The statement was so unexpected I nearly choked on my own breath. Envy me? The freedom of it, to step outside convention, to choose your own path rather than having it chosen for you. Most of us are bound by expectations from birth, who we must marry, how we must behave, what roles we must play. You're writing your own story. I had never thought of it that way. To me, my situation felt precarious and uncertain. But from her perspective, it represented a kind of liberation I hadn't recognized. "I hope your story has a happy ending," she added gently. The conversation stayed with me for days, changing how I viewed my own circumstances. Perhaps this wasn't just about following Damon wherever he led. Perhaps it was also about discovering who I could become when freed from the narrow confines of my previous existence. The practical preparations were overwhelming in their complexity. Damon handled most of the official arrangements: transfer of my service contract, travel permits, letters of introduction to the household staff at Ravenscroft Keep. But there were personal preparations that fell to me. My belongings still fit into a single cloth bag, but Damon had quietly arranged for a modest wardrobe appropriate to my new status. Not the elaborate silks and velvets of noble ladies, but well-made wool dresses in colours other than grey, cloaks lined with fur against the northern cold, proper travelling clothes that would allow me to ride comfortably for long distances. The consideration behind these arrangements was staggering. He had thought of everything from the practical necessities of warmth and protection to the psychological impact of having clothes that made me feel less like a servant and more like a person worthy of respect. "You thought of everything," I told him when he showed me the carefully packed travelling chest. "I tried," he replied, but there was something in his expression that suggested he was nervous about my reaction. "Why?" I asked. "Why go to all this trouble?" He was quiet for a moment, his fingers tracing patterns on the wooden surface of the chest. When he looked up, his eyes held that vulnerable expression I was beginning to recognize. "Because I want this to work," he said simply. "I want you to feel like you belong wherever we go. I want you to have choices and comfort and the respect you deserve." The words made my chest tight with emotion. No one had ever wanted my comfort before, had ever considered my sense of belonging important enough to plan for. "I don't know how to repay such kindness," I said softly. "You don't repay it," he replied, reaching out to cup my face with gentle hands. "You simply be yourself. That's all I've ever wanted." As our departure date approached, I found myself oscillating between excitement and terror. The unknown stretched ahead like an uncharted sea, dangerous but full of possibilities I had never dared to imagine. The night before we were to leave, I stood in my tiny chamber looking around at the space that had been my entire world for 17 years. The narrow bed, the single window, the wooden chest that held my few possessions. It had never been much, but it had been safe, predictable. Tomorrow, I would leave all of it behind to follow a man I was still learning to know, toward a future that existed only in hope and possibility. The thought terrified and thrilled me in equal measure. But as I settled into sleep for the last time in this familiar space, I realized that I had never been more ready for change. The girl who had stood invisible in the shadows was gone. In her place was a woman brave enough to step into the light and claim her place in her own story. And that woman was ready to discover what she was capable of becoming. On the morning of our departure, I woke before dawn with a mixture of anticipation and terror coursing through my veins. The castle was still quiet as I made my final preparations, most of the household still lost in sleep. My few personal belongings had been packed days before, and the travelling chest Damon had arranged sat ready by my door. Everything I owned in the world, everything I was bringing into my new life, fit into one wooden box and a small cloth bag. The simplicity should have been depressing. Instead, it felt liberating. I was leaving with nothing but possibility. I dressed carefully in one of the new travelling gowns, a deep blue wool that brought out my eyes and made my pale skin look less washed out. The fabric was finer than anything I had ever owned, soft against my skin and cut in lines that actually flattered my slight figure. Looking at my reflection in the small mirror, I barely recognized myself. Not because I looked dramatically different, but because for the first time in my life, I looked like someone who mattered, someone who belonged in her own skin. The goodbye to Cook was harder than I had expected. She waited for me in the kitchen, her weathered face stern with emotion she refused to name. "You remember what I told you," she said gruffly, pulling me into a fierce hug that smelled of bread dough and herbs. "Keep your heart careful, but don't be afraid to use it." She pressed something into my hands, a small wooden spoon carved with intricate patterns. "My grandmother gave this to me when I left home," she explained. "Said it would always remind me that no matter how far I travelled, I could make anywhere feel like home." The gift was so unexpected, so precious, that tears sprang to my eyes immediately. Cook had never shown me such affection before, had barely acknowledged my existence for most of the years I had worked under her direction. "I'll treasure it," I promised, meaning every word. "See that you do. And write to me, girl. These old eyes will be watching for your letters." Mary from the gardens was waiting in the courtyard when I emerged with my travelling chest, her expression a complicated mixture of envy and genuine good wishes. Thomas, the baker's apprentice, actually blushed when he offered me a small packet of honey cakes for the journey, mumbling something about sustenance for the road. Even some of the servants who had barely spoken to me over the years offered polite farewells and wishes for safe travel. I was visible to them now in a way I had never been before, not just as a pair of hands to help with the work, but as a person embarking on her own adventure. Damon was waiting by the horses when I arrived, and the sight of him took my breath away all over again. He wore travelling leathers instead of court finery, practical clothes that somehow made him look more dangerous rather than less. His dark horse stamped restlessly, eager to be away, while a smaller chestnut mare stood patiently beside the mounting block. "Her name is Ember," he said, stroking the mare's neck with obvious affection. "She's gentle with inexperienced riders and has the smoothest gait in the stable. You'll be comfortable with her." I had ridden only a few times in my life, and never for any significant distance, but when Damon helped me into the saddle, his hands steadying me with careful attention, I felt more excited than frightened. As we rode through the castle gates and onto the road that led north, I felt the weight of watching eyes behind us, some curious, some disapproving, some envious. Lady Meredith had made a point of being visible in one of the tower windows, her expression coldly triumphant, as if my leaving proved some point she had been making. But Sir James had surprised me by appearing in the courtyard to see us off, offering a courteous bow and genuine wishes for a safe journey. Lady Catherine had done the same, her kindness a reminder that not everyone at court was small-minded or cruel. King Aldrich himself had spoken to us briefly the evening before, his manner formal but not unkind. He had reminded Damon of his duties in the north, but had also expressed hope that the change of scenery would prove beneficial to all parties involved. The careful phrasing suggested royal awareness of the difficulties we had faced, and perhaps royal approval of our decision to seek space away from those difficulties. As the castle faded behind us and the road stretched ahead, I felt something inside me beginning to unfurl like a flower finding sunlight. For the first time in my life, I was travelling towards something I wanted rather than simply enduring what was given to me. The morning air was crisp with autumn's bite, and the landscape rolled away on either side in waves of gold and amber. Hills covered in turning leaves, streams that caught the light like scattered diamonds, farmhouses sending up lazy spirals of smoke from their chimneys. I had never seen the world from horseback before, never experienced the particular joy of moving through a landscape that seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. We rode mostly in comfortable silence, but when we did speak, the conversations had a different quality than our stolen moments in the castle. Here, with no servants to overhear and no nobles to judge, we could be completely ourselves. Damon told me about Ravenscroft, keep a smaller fortress built to guard an important mountain pass, surrounded by forests and meadows that transformed into a winter wonderland when the snows came. The household was small but efficient, he explained, mostly long-time retainers who had served the crown's interests in the north for decades. "They're good people," he assured me. "Practical, hard-working, not given to court gossip or social posturing. I think you'll find them easier company than what we left behind." I told him about my dreams of travel, of seeing the ocean that I had only read about in books, of experiencing seasons in places where the rhythms might be different from what I knew. Small dreams, perhaps, but they felt enormous as I spoke them aloud to someone who listened with genuine interest. "The sea is only 2 days' ride from Ravenscroft," he said. "When spring comes, if you want, we can ride to the coast. I think you'd like it the way it stretches to the horizon, the sound of waves against rocks." The casual way he spoke of "when spring comes," as if my presence in his future was a settled fact rather than a hopeful possibility, made my heart flutter. When we stopped for our midday meal beside a clear stream, he helped me down from Ember's back with gentle hands that lingered at my waist. The intimacy of the gesture, the casualness of his touch, still made my heart race despite weeks of growing familiarity. We shared bread and cheese and wine while the horses grazed nearby, and I marveled at the simple pleasure of eating a meal without having to serve it first, of sitting on soft grass instead of standing against stone walls. of being companion rather than servant. "Are you tired?" he asked, noting the way I rolled my shoulders to ease the stiffness from unaccustomed riding. "A little," I admitted, "but it's good tired. Like I'm finally using muscles I didn't know I had." The smile that crossed his face at my words was soft and understanding. "That's exactly what it's like," he agreed, "learning to live instead of just surviving." As we continued north through the afternoon, I realized that he was right. For 17 years, I had been surviving existing in the spaces between other people's lives, making myself small enough to avoid notice, accepting invisibility as the price of safety. But now, with the road stretching ahead and his steady presence beside me, I was beginning to understand what it might feel like to actually live. The future was uncertain. I didn't know what waited for us at Ravenscroft Keep, or how we would navigate the complexities of building a relationship outside the artificial constraints of court, or whether this impossible thing between us could survive the test of ordinary days and shared routines. But for the first time in my life, uncertainty felt like possibility rather than threat. As the sun began to set ahead of us, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, we created a hill that offered our first glimpse of the northern mountains. They rose in the distance like sleeping giants, their peaks already dusted with early snow, their slopes dark with pine forests that seemed to stretch forever. "Ravenscroft is there," Damon said, pointing toward a gap between two peaks, hidden in the pass, protected by the mountains themselves. The landscape was more beautiful than anything I had ever imagined, wild and vast and completely different from the manicured grounds around the royal castle. It looked like freedom given physical form. "Are you ready for this?" he asked quietly. I looked at him, really looked at him, this man who had chosen to see me when the rest of the world had been content to look through me. His dark eyes held uncertainty and hope in equal measure, the same emotions that were warring in my own chest. "I'm terrified," I admitted, "but I'm ready." He smiled then, that rare, transformative expression that made him look almost human. "Good, because I have a feeling we're about to discover things about ourselves we never knew existed." As we rode toward the mountains and whatever awaited us in their shadow, I realized he was probably right. The girl who had stood invisible in the shadows was truly gone. In her place was a woman brave enough to step into the light and claim her place in her own story. And that woman was just beginning to discover what she was capable of becoming. Ravenscroft Keep emerged from the mountain mists like something from a fairy tale. Unlike the sprawling royal castle with its multiple towers and endless courtyards, this fortress was compact and purposeful, built of dark stone that seemed to grow from the mountain itself. It perched on a rocky outcrop overlooking the pass, its walls following the natural contours of the land in a way that made it seem both impregnable and graceful. "It's beautiful," I breathed, reining in Ember to get a better look. Damon pulled up beside me, his expression softening as he saw my reaction. "It's home," he said simply. "At least, it's the closest thing I've had to one in years." The admission made my chest tight. I was beginning to understand that his life, for all its apparent privilege, had been as rootless as my own. We were both strangers to the concept of belonging somewhere. As we approached the gates, I felt my nervousness spike. These people knew him, had worked with him for years. What would they make of his unprecedented companion? How would they receive a former servant who had somehow found her way into their lord's confidence? But my concerns proved largely unfounded. The guards who opened the gates greeted Damon with obvious warmth and respect, and when he introduced me simply as Lady Alara, who will be staying through the winter months, they offered courteous bows and genuine welcomes. No questions about my background or suitability, no speculative glances or whispered conversations, just practical efficiency in seeing us settled and comfortable after our long journey. The interior of the keep was as surprising as its exterior. Where I had expected cold stone and military starkness, I found warmth and comfort. Tapestries covered the walls, their rich colors depicting scenes of mountain life hunters and their prey, festivals around harvest time, winter scenes of extraordinary beauty. Fires crackled in well-maintained hearths, and the air smelled of pine logs and something that might have been fresh bread. Mrs. Hawthorne, the head of household, was a woman of perhaps 50 years with kind eyes and an efficiently organized mind. She welcomed me with the same matter-of-fact courtesy she might have shown any guest, quickly arranging for my belongings to be taken to the Blue Chamber and inquiring about my needs after the journey. "I've prepared the rooms adjacent to Sir Damon's quarters," she explained as she led me through corridors lit by oil lamps that cast warm, dancing shadows. They share a sitting room, but each has its own bedchamber and private entrance. I thought the arrangement would provide both convenience and propriety. The consideration implicit in her planning made me grateful. She had found a way to acknowledge our relationship while protecting my reputation, creating space for intimacy while maintaining the appearance of proper separation. The Blue Chamber was a revelation. Larger than my entire quarters at the royal castle, it was furnished with obvious care, a comfortable bed with soft mattresses and warm quilts, a writing desk positioned near a window that looked out over the mountain valleys, shelves lined with books that someone had carefully selected. A fire had already been lit in the small hearth, making the room feel welcoming and lived in. "Sir Damon thought you might enjoy the books, Mrs. Hawthorne said, noting my fascination with the collection. He's been gathering them for months: poetry, histories of the region, tales of travel to distant lands. Months. He had been planning this, preparing for my arrival, long before he had asked me to come. The realization made my heart flutter. "Thank you," I managed. "This island, more than I expected." She smiled with genuine warmth. "You're very welcome, my lady. Sir Damon has seemed much happier since he found something worth being happy about. We're all grateful for that." After she left me to settle in, I stood at the window watching the sun set behind the mountains and tried to process the magnitude of the change in my circumstances. 3 weeks ago, I had been invisible, sleeping in a servant's quarters barely large enough for a single bed. Now I was installed in chambers fit for a noble, with books chosen specifically for my interests and a view that took my breath away. The transformation felt surreal, like something that had happened to someone else. A soft knock at the door connecting my chamber to the shared sitting room interrupted my thoughts. I opened it to find Damon, now dressed in simple clothes instead of traveling leathers, holding a bottle of wine and wearing an expression of carefully controlled nervousness. "How do you find your quarters?" he asked. "Perfect," I replied honestly. "More than perfect. Thank you for all of this." He set the wine on the small table by the sitting room fire and turned to face me fully. In the lamplight, with his formal armor replaced by ordinary clothing, he looked younger and infinitely more approachable. "I wanted you to feel at home here," he said. "I wanted you to have space that was truly your own, not just borrowed or temporary." The word home hung between us, heavy with implications neither of us was quite ready to explore fully. "Are you hungry?" he asked. "Mrs. Hawthorne has prepared supper, but I thought we might eat here rather than in the great hall. Give you time to adjust before meeting the full household." The consideration was typical of his thoughtful approach to everything concerning me. I nodded gratefully, and within minutes an efficient parade of servants had laid out a meal that put the royal castle's formal dinners to shame: roasted meat that fell off the bone, vegetables that had clearly been picked that day, bread still warm from the ovens, and wine that was smooth and rich without being overpowering. We ate mostly in comfortable silence, the strain of travel and transition finally catching up with both of us. But as the wine and warmth worked their magic, I found myself relaxing in ways I hadn't been able to for weeks. "What happens now?" I asked eventually, voicing the question that had been haunting me since we left the royal castle. "Now," he said, leaning back in his chair with an expression more peaceful than I had ever seen on his face, "we have time. Time to discover what this is between us, without the pressure of constant observation. Time to simply exist in the same space and see what develops." The idea of unhurried time, of being able to explore our connection without the weight of expectation and judgment, was intoxicating. "I've never had time before," I admitted. Everything has always been urgent tasks that needed completing, meals that needed serving, duties that couldn't wait. The idea of time just existing is strange. Then we'll learn together, he said, reaching across the small table to take my hand. We'll learn what it's like to wake up in the morning and choose how to spend our hours based on what we want rather than what's required of us. His fingers were warm and calloused against mine, familiar now but still capable of sending electricity racing through my entire body. Damon, I said softly, testing the sound of his name in my mouth. Yes? Thank you. For this, for everything, for seeing me. Instead of responding with words, he lifted my hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to my knuckles. The gesture was tender and respectful and absolutely perfect for this moment of quiet connection. As the evening wound down and we prepared to retire to our separate chambers, I felt a contentment I had never experienced before. Not the exhausted satisfaction of a day's work completed, but the deep peace of being exactly where I belonged, with exactly the person I was meant to be with. Standing at the window in my beautiful room, looking out at mountains that were becoming familiar, I realized that Mrs. Hawthorne had been right. Damon did seem happier. But more than that, I was beginning to understand what happiness actually felt like. Tomorrow would bring new discoveries, new challenges, new opportunities to learn about ourselves and each other. But tonight, for the first time in my life, I fell asleep feeling completely and utterly safe. The transformation was complete. The invisible servant girl was gone forever, replaced by a woman brave enough to claim her own story and strong enough to build her own happiness. And that woman was exactly where she was meant to be. 6 months later, as spring returned to the mountain pass and wildflowers began to bloom in the meadows surrounding Ravenscroft Keep, I sat at my writing desk, composing a letter to Cook. The words flowed easily now, filled with stories of my new life and the discoveries I had made about myself in the freedom of the northern wilderness. You were right, I wrote, about hearts being fragile, things that need practice at being cared for. Mine has had considerable practice these past months, and I'm pleased to report it has grown stronger rather than more fragile. I've learned that love is not about being chosen by someone else, but about choosing to be brave enough to reach for happiness when it presents itself. The girl you knew is gone, transformed by the simple act of being seen and valued for who she truly was. In her place is a woman who has learned to take up space in the world, to speak her thoughts aloud, to believe she deserves the happiness she has found. I think you would be proud of who I have become. As I sealed the letter and prepared to send it south with the next supply convoy, I realized that every word was true. The transformation that had begun with a single moment of recognition across a crowded hall was now complete. I was no longer invisible. I was no longer afraid, and I was finally, truly home.